Welcome to the HFY Tales channel. Remember to like and subscribe if you like the story. Enjoy and take care.
The twin moons hung low over the horizon, casting a silvery glow across the rocky terrain. The distant sound of howling winds carried through the canyons, and the faint hum of abandoned machinery echoed like ghosts of a forgotten war. Evan Westwood crouched on the edge of a cliff, his gaze scanning the wasteland below. He had been stationed on this forsaken planet for over 2 years, working as a hired mercenary for various factions. But this world never felt like home. It was just another stop in his long journey away from everything he had once known. His eyes caught movement below, something small, struggling to move. Adjusting the settings on his optical scope, he zoomed in. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. It was a woman, her body battered and covered in dirt. She was crawling across the rocky surface, dragging herself with one arm while cradling her swollen belly with the other. She was pregnant, and she was alien. Evan cursed under his breath. The last thing he needed was to get involved in someone else's problems, especially on this planet where betrayal was as common as dust storms. But something about her struck him. The desperation in her movements, the vulnerability of her condition. It tugged at something deep inside him. Something he thought he had buried long ago. Without another thought, Evan slid down the rocky slope, moving toward the woman. His steps were quick but cautious. He could already tell from her appearance that she wasn't human. Her skin was a deep shade of violet, marred by dirt and dried blood. Her features were angular, yet strikingly beautiful in their alien way. And her eyes, though half-closed, glowed faintly, a sign of her telepathic abilities, common among the Seraph people, he guessed. As he reached her, she flinched, her body tensing as though expecting an attack. Evan knelt beside her, his voice low and calm. "Easy there," he said, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her breathing was labored, each breath coming in shallow gasps. Her eyes flickered open for a moment, locking onto his. There was fear there, but also relief. She tried to speak, but only a soft, hoarse whisper escaped her lips. "Help me." Evan frowned. She wasn't going to last long without medical attention, and the nearest outpost was too far for her to make it. He would have to take her to his own hideout, a risky move, but the only option if she was going to survive. "I'm going to carry you," he said. "Don't fight me." Carefully, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body frail from exhaustion and malnutrition. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel the faint pulse of life inside her. Not just hers, but the two growing within her. The realization that she was carrying twins hit him hard, stirring an unexpected wave of protectiveness. The journey back to his shelter was a silent one, with only the wind and the crunch of gravel under his boots for company. As they approached the hidden entrance, a concealed cave built into the cliffs, Evan could feel the woman's condition worsening. Her breathing grew shallower, and her skin felt cold against his arms. Once inside, he gently laid her down on a makeshift cot and went straight to work. His shelter was small but well-equipped. His military background ensured he was always prepared. He retrieved a medkit from a nearby shelf and began administering a series of injections designed to stabilize her condition. It wasn't much, but it would buy her some time. Minutes passed, and her breathing slowly steadied. Evan sat back, wiping the sweat from his brow as he watched her. He didn't know who she was or why she had been out there, but he had a feeling this was just the beginning of something much larger. He could see the signs of pursuit, the small wounds that indicated recent combat. Someone had been hunting her. The woman stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. She gazed at him, confusion and pain etched across her alien features. Why did you help me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Evan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You needed help. That's all there is to it." Her eyes softened, but a deep sorrow remained in them. You don't know what you're getting into." "Maybe not," he replied, his tone gruff. "But you're safe now. Rest. We'll figure this out when you're stronger." The woman's eyes closed again, this time in a fitful but much-needed sleep. Evan stood and moved to the entrance of the shelter, his mind racing. Whoever she was, whatever her story, it was clear that danger followed her. And now, by saving her, he had drawn himself into that danger. He stared out into the night, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sidearm. This planet had a way of forcing people into impossible choices, and tonight had been no different. He just hoped that by saving her, he hadn't condemned them both. The next morning, a soft light filtered through the small cracks in the cave's ceiling. The shelter was still, with only the hum of an air filtration unit and the occasional drip of water breaking the silence. Evan sat at a makeshift table, cleaning his weapons with precise mechanical motions. His mind, however, was elsewhere, on the alien woman lying on the cot just a few feet away. She had slept through the night, her breathing steady now, though her face remained tense, as if haunted by unseen nightmares. He had seen it before, people who had lost everything in war, trapped in an endless cycle of pain even in their sleep. Evan put down his weapon and approached her. The woman stirred, her violet skin glowing faintly as the telepathic energy inside her began to awaken. Her eyes slowly fluttered open, revealing that faint luminescent glow once more. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and Evan felt a strange warmth in his chest, a connection he couldn't quite explain. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice gruff but laced with concern. She blinked slowly, as if gathering her thoughts. "Better, thanks to you," she whispered, her voice still weak. She shifted slightly, wincing as she adjusted her body. "Where am I?" "My hideout," Evan replied. "It's safe here, at least for now. I found you out in the wastelands, barely hanging on. You're lucky I came by when I did." A look of uncertainty crossed her face, and she slowly sat up, though her movements were strained. Her hands instinctively went to her belly, and Evan could see the way she cradled it protectively. "The twins," she murmured, her voice tinged with fear. "They're fine," Evan assured her. "You were in bad shape, but I was able to stabilize you. As for the babies, they're strong." He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should mention what he had felt, an odd sense of connection, as though the unborn children had somehow reached out to him. But he dismissed the thought. It was impossible. The woman's eyes softened with relief, and she leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. "I owe you my life," she said quietly. Evan shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Just rest. You need to recover if you want to make it out of here alive." There was a pause as the silence between them deepened. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Then, the woman broke the silence, her voice soft but determined. "My name is Laura," she said, her gaze meeting his once more. "I come from the Sereth people, though I imagine you've already guessed that." Evan nodded. "I've heard of your kind, telepaths. Not many of you out here, though. Most Sereth stick to their home world." Laura's expression darkened, and she looked away. "Not anymore," she said bitterly. "My people are in the middle of a civil war. My family, my husband, they were caught in the conflict. I've been on the run ever since." Evan frowned, leaning against the wall as he crossed his arms. "Civil war? I thought the Sereth were one of the most unified species out there." Laura let out a sad laugh, her voice filled with bitterness. "Unity is fragile. We were once strong, yes, but power always breeds ambition. Some factions want control over the rest of the galaxy, while others believe we should stay isolated. My husband, Corin, was one of the leaders who fought for peace, but he was killed for it." Evan felt a pang of sympathy, but kept his expression neutral. "And you?" "I was his bond mate," Laura said, her voice quieter now. "When he died, I became a target for those who wanted to eliminate his influence. They want my children, Corin's legacy, either to control them or destroy them." Evan's jaw tightened. The idea of anyone hunting down a pregnant woman and her unborn children sickened him, but he knew better than to show it. He had learned long ago to keep his emotions in check. "So those hunters that came after you, they're still out there?" Laura nodded. "They won't stop until they have me and my children. We carry powerful telepathic abilities, abilities that some would use for war." Evan's mind raced, piecing together the situation. It was worse than he thought. Not only had he saved a woman fleeing a civil war, but she was also being hunted by enemies who would stop at nothing to capture her children. He had put himself in the middle of something far bigger than he had anticipated. "You said something yesterday," Laura continued, breaking into his thoughts. "You said I didn't know what I was getting into. But I think it's you who doesn't know what you've done." She smiled weakly. "You've bound yourself to me now, Evan Westwood. You're part of this, whether you want to be or not." Evan shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. He wasn't the type to get involved in anyone's affairs, let alone become part of an alien civil war. But the moment he had picked her up, something had shifted inside him. He had felt a sense of responsibility, a duty to protect her and the children. And now, it was too late to turn back. "I didn't do it for the politics," he said gruffly. "I did it because you needed help." Laura's eyes softened again, and she reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. A strange warmth flowed through him at her touch, and for a moment, it was as though their thoughts merged, like a faint echo of each other's minds. He quickly pulled away, unsettled by the sensation. "You feel it, don't you?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The bond, it's growing stronger." Evan clenched his fists. "I don't know what you're talking about." But he did know. He could feel the connection, an inexplicable link forming between them. Whether it was because of her telepathic abilities or something deeper, he wasn't sure. All he knew was that the more time he spent with her, the harder it would be to walk away. "I'll help you get out of here," he said after a long pause. "But after that, you're on your own." Laura looked at him, her expression unreadable. "We'll see." Evan turned away, his mind racing. He didn't want to admit it, but deep down, he knew he was already too involved. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't be able to walk away. Not from her, and certainly not from the children she carried. The air inside the shelter felt heavier as the days passed. Evan had made sure to stockpile supplies, enough to last him for weeks. But he knew their time in the cave was limited. The bounty hunters were still out there, and if they got wind of Laura's presence, the fight that followed would be one Evan might not survive. Laura had regained some of her strength, though she still spent most of her time resting. Her belly had grown noticeably larger over the past few days, a sign that the twins were close to being born. Evan watched over her, always on guard, always thinking about their next move. But there was another complication, a bond that continued to grow between them, something neither of them could control. He could feel it more clearly now, an almost physical connection to her and the children. Every time their eyes met, every time he heard her voice, it was as though an invisible thread was pulling him closer to her. Laura, too, seemed aware of it. She often caught him watching her, her expression unreadable, as though she were trying to understand something that eluded her. They had exchanged few words since their conversation about the bond, but the silence between them was charged with unspoken emotions. One evening, as the sun set and the rocky landscape outside the cave was bathed in twilight, Laura finally broke the silence. "You feel them too, don't you?" she asked quietly, her voice soft but filled with certainty. Evan didn't answer immediately. He had been avoiding this conversation for days, refusing to acknowledge what was happening between them. But he couldn't deny it any longer. "I feel something," he admitted, his tone guarded. Laura smiled faintly, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "The twins, they've been reaching out to you since the moment you saved me. They see you as their protector, their guardian. It's their way of bonding with the one who will keep them safe." Evan leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. "I'm no one's guardian. I'm just trying to get us out of here alive." Laura shook her head slowly. "It's more than that, Evan. The Seraph believe in bonds that transcend physical ties. My children, even unborn, have connected with you. They sense your strength, your resolve, and your heart." Evan's jaw clenched at her words. He didn't like where this conversation was going. He had been a soldier for most of his life, and soldiers didn't allow themselves to get attached. It made things complicated, messy, and he had learned long ago that complications led to pain. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered. "I know," Laura said softly, "but it's not something you can choose to accept or reject. The bond is already there." And I can feel it too." Her last words lingered in the air between them. Evan didn't respond, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to admit that he had felt something for her ever since he carried her to the shelter. Something more than just duty, more than the instinct to protect. But acknowledging it felt dangerous, like stepping into an unknown territory he wasn't ready to explore. He stood up abruptly, turning away from her. "We need to focus on getting out of here. The longer we stay, the more likely it is that someone will find us." Laura didn't push the conversation further, though Evan could feel her eyes on him as he gathered supplies. The connection between them simmered just beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing day. And Evan couldn't ignore it forever. As the days went on, the tension mounted. Evan had fortified the cave's entrance, setting traps and alarms to alert them to any intruders. But the sense of danger never left him. He could feel it creeping closer, like a storm waiting to break. Then, one night, everything changed. Evan had been out scouting the surrounding area, checking for any signs of the bounty hunters. When he returned to the shelter, something felt wrong. The air inside was thick, the silence oppressive. He stepped cautiously into the cave, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun. "Laura!" he called out, his voice echoing through the small space. There was no response. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved deeper into the cave, his senses on high alert. Then he saw her. Laura was sitting on the edge of the cot, her eyes closed, her hands pressed against her belly. Her breathing was slow and deliberate, and the air around her seemed to shimmer with a faint, almost imperceptible energy. Evan took a step forward, his concern growing. "Laura, what's happening?" She didn't answer at first, her focus entirely on the twins inside her. But then, without opening her eyes, she spoke, her voice distant, as if she were speaking from somewhere far away. "They're coming." Evan's blood ran cold. "Who's coming?" "The bounty hunters," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They found us. They're close." Evan's instincts kicked in, and he moved quickly, grabbing his weapons and preparing for the worst. He knew this moment would come sooner or later, but now that it was here, he realized how unprepared he felt. He was responsible for more than just himself. Laura and the twins' lives were in his hands. As he worked, Laura's energy seemed to pulse through the air, and Evan could feel the connection between them intensify. The twins, sensing the danger, reached out to him telepathically, their presence brushing against his mind. It was a strange sensation, but not entirely unwelcome. He could feel their fear, their uncertainty, and most of all, their trust in him. "I'll protect you," Evan muttered under his breath, though whether he was speaking to the twins, Laura, or himself, he wasn't sure. The night was eerily still as Evan prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The bounty hunters were closing in, and the only question now was whether he could fight them off or if they would be overrun. Either way, there was no turning back. As the minutes ticked by, Evan took one last look at Laura, who had finally opened her eyes. She met his gaze, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a silent promise. They would face whatever came next together. The air outside the cave had grown colder, a biting wind howling through the canyon, carrying with it the ominous weight of what was to come. Evan's heart raced as he stood near the entrance of the shelter, his weapon gripped tightly in his hands. He had reinforced their defenses the best he could, but he knew it might not be enough. The bounty hunters tracking Laura were professionals, and they were likely armed to the teeth. Laura remained inside, her strength still fragile, but her telepathic energy radiating in waves that Evan could feel. She had warned him that the twins were growing restless, their fear and anxiety feeding into the connection they shared with their mother, and strangely with Evan. The bond between him and the unborn children was becoming more intense with each passing hour, as though they were drawing strength from him, trusting him to keep them safe. "They're here," Laura's voice echoed in his mind, though she hadn't spoken aloud. Evan wasn't sure how much longer he could pretend the telepathic link between them wasn't real. He could feel her thoughts brush against his, urgent and full of fear. The twins' presence hovered at the edge of his consciousness, tiny but undeniably there. Evan scanned the darkness outside the cave, his senses sharp. His military training had taught him to anticipate danger And tonight, every nerve in his body was on high alert. He didn't have long to wait. A faint hum cut through the wind, the sound of approaching hovercrafts. Evan's grip tightened on his rifle as he crouched behind a rock, peering out at the shadowy figures moving toward the cave. There were at least 5 of them, their armored suits gleaming faintly in the moonlight. They moved with the precision of trained killers, their weapons drawn, their footsteps silent on the rocky terrain. Evan's pulse quickened. He had fought in plenty of battles before, but this was different. He wasn't just fighting for his own life. He was protecting Laura and the twins. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him, but it also gave him a fierce sense of purpose. He wouldn't let them be captured, no matter what. The first bounty hunter came into view, his visor scanning the area for any signs of movement. Evan held his breath, waiting for the perfect moment. The second hunter followed close behind, their weapons at the ready. Evan's mind raced. He couldn't take them all at once, but if he could pick them off one by one. With a sharp exhale, Evan fired his first shot. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the canyon, and the lead hunter dropped to the ground with a muffled thud, a clean shot to the head. Before the others could react, Evan rolled to a new position, taking cover behind a boulder as the remaining hunters scattered in search of him. "Stay calm," Evan muttered to himself, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You've got this." He could hear their voices now, muffled through their helmets, but clear enough to understand. They were coordinating, flanking his position. He had to move fast. Evan fired again, this time hitting one of the hunters in the leg. The armored figure stumbled, letting out a grunt of pain. But before Evan could finish the job, another shot rang out, this one aimed at him. He barely had time to duck behind the rock, the energy blast whizzing past his ear. Too close. The hunters were closing in. He could feel them pressing him into a corner, their tactics precise, their movements relentless. But Evan wasn't about to give up. He had fought against worse odds before, and he had always come out on top. This was no different. Another burst of gunfire, another hunter down. 3 left. "Evan." Laura's voice suddenly filled his mind again, startling him. "I can help you." He gritted his teeth, focusing on the battle in front of him. "Stay where you are," he said aloud, though he knew she could hear his thoughts. "I've got this." But Laura didn't listen. A sudden wave of energy rippled through the air, and Evan felt it like a jolt to his system. The bounty hunters hesitated for a fraction of a second, their movements faltering as though they had been hit by an invisible force. It wasn't enough to incapacitate them, but it gave Evan the opening he needed. He surged forward, his rifle blazing. Another hunter fell, their bodies slumping to the ground as Evan spun around to take out the next. Only one remained now, but this one was smarter, keeping his distance as he fired at Evan from behind a rock. The energy blast scorched the ground around Evan's feet, forcing him to dive for cover again. For a moment, silence fell over the canyon. Evan's breath came in short gasps, his muscles tense as he waited for the final attack. He knew the last bounty hunter wouldn't go down easily, but he was ready for whatever came next. Suddenly, the air grew thick with a strange, electric charge. Evan's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced back toward the cave. Laura stood at the entrance, her eyes glowing with the intense light of her telepathic power. The air around her shimmered, and Evan could feel the energy pulsing from her, reaching out into the night. "Laura, what are you doing?" he shouted, his voice tinged with panic. She was still too weak to use her abilities like this, but Laura didn't respond. Instead, she raised her hand, her fingers splayed as if she were reaching for something unseen. The last bounty hunter suddenly froze in place, his weapon dropping from his hand as he clutched his head, a pained scream tearing from his throat. Evan watched in shock as the hunter fell to his knees, the telepathic assault too much for his mind to bear. Within seconds, he collapsed unconscious. Laura swayed on her feet, her energy fading as quickly as it had flared. Evan rushed to her side, catching her just as she stumbled. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice filled with concern as he helped her back into the cave. "You're not strong enough." "I had to," Laura whispered, her breath labored. "They would have killed you." Evan's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to tell her that he could have handled it. But deep down, he knew she was right. Without her intervention, he might not have survived. The bond between them, between him and the twins, was stronger than he had realized. They had protected each other. He laid Laura down on the cot, his hand lingering on her arm for a moment longer than necessary. She looked up at him, her violet eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something deeper that Evan wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. "Rest," he said softly. "We're safe for now." But even as he said the words, he knew the danger wasn't over. The bounty hunters might have been dealt with, but more would come. And now, there was no denying it. He was bound to Laura and her children in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. They were his responsibility, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. The days that followed the battle were quieter, but the tension remained thick in the air. Evan kept watch, always expecting another group of bounty hunters to show up. Though they had dealt with the immediate threat, he knew it was only a matter of time before more would come, and each attack would be fiercer than the last. Inside the cave, Laura's strength was slowly returning, but her mental exhaustion was harder to shake. Using her telepathic powers to stop the final bounty hunter had taken more out of her than she had let on. She spent most of her time resting, her hands protectively cradling her growing belly. The twins, it seemed, were drawing closer to being born, and with their birth came new dangers. The bond between Evan and the twins had grown stronger since the fight. He couldn't deny it any longer. There was a connection, something powerful and unexplainable. Every time he closed his eyes, he could feel their presence, faint but insistent, like whispers at the edge of his mind. And Laura, he felt her too, her emotions intertwining with his in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. Evan sat near the entrance of the shelter, his rifle propped against the wall beside him. The canyon outside was eerily still, the wind having died down to nothing. He stared out into the darkness, his thoughts drifting. "You're quiet today." Laura's voice broke the silence, soft and filled with curiosity. Evan glanced back at her. She was sitting up on the cot now, her violet eyes watching him with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. He still wasn't sure how to act around her. There was something about her presence that threw him off balance, something that had nothing to do with her telepathic abilities. "Just thinking," he replied, his tone gruff. Laura smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. "About the twins?" Evan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, it's strange. I can feel them sometimes, like they're trying to communicate with me." "They are," Laura said softly, shifting slightly to make herself more comfortable. "They've bonded with you. It's rare, but not unheard of in our culture. When a Sarth child senses someone's strength and protection, they reach out to that person, forming a link. In a way, they've chosen you." Evan's chest tightened at her words. He had always seen himself as a lone wolf, someone who didn't need attachments or obligations. But now, these unborn children had chosen him as their protector, and the weight of that responsibility was heavier than anything he had ever carried. "I'm no father," he muttered, shaking his head. "I'm just a soldier." Laura's gaze softened. "You're more than that, Evan. You've already done more for us than anyone else would have. You saved my life, and now you're keeping us safe. The twins, they see you as their father, whether you're ready for that or not." Evan looked away, his mind racing. He wasn't ready for this. He had never imagined himself as a father figure, let alone to alien children. But the more time he spent with Laura, the harder it was to deny that something had shifted inside him. He cared about her, about the twins. They weren't just his responsibility anymore. They were becoming his family. The thought both terrified and excited him. Laura's voice cut through his thoughts again, softer this time, almost hesitant. "Evan, I've been thinking about what happens next. The twins will be born soon, and we can't stay here forever. Once they're here, we'll be more vulnerable than ever." Evan nodded grimly. "I know. I've been working on a plan. There's an old cargo ship buried in one of the canyons about 10 miles from here. I found it a few months ago while scouting. It's not in great shape, but I think I can get it running. If we can reach it, we might be able to get off this planet." Laura's eyes brightened with hope, but there was a flicker of uncertainty there as well. And after that, where would we go? Evan shrugged. We'll figure it out. There are a few places we could lie low. Places where even the Seraph wouldn't think to look. The important thing is to get you and the twins to safety. After that, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Laura smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. You make it sound so simple. It's not, Evan said, his voice firm. But it's the only chance we've got. The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken emotions. Evan could feel the weight of Laura's gaze on him, her thoughts brushing against his in that subtle, telepathic way she had. She was grateful. He could sense that. But there was something more beneath the surface. Something deeper. Evan, Laura's voice was soft, almost a whisper now. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You don't need to thank me, he replied, his throat tightening. I'm just doing what needs to be done. But Laura shook her head, her expression serious. It's more than that. You've gone above and beyond. You've put your life at risk for us, even though you had no reason to. I don't know if I can ever repay you. Evan's chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't just the weight of responsibility he felt. It was something else, something that had been building between them since the moment he had saved her in the wasteland. He had tried to ignore it, to push it aside, but now, sitting here with her, feeling the warmth of her presence so close, it was impossible to deny. You don't owe me anything, Laura, he said quietly. We're in this together. Laura's eyes softened, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. The bond between them, the connection that had been growing ever since that first night, intensified, wrapping around them like a protective shield. Evan could feel her emotions as clearly as his own, and he knew she could feel his. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through him, and for a moment they both froze, caught in the intensity of the moment. Laura didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her gaze locked on his. Evan, before she could say anything more, a sharp, sudden pain crossed her face, and she gasped, clutching her belly. Evan's heart leaped into his throat, and he was at her side in an instant. Laura, what's wrong? He asked, his voice laced with panic. The twins, she whispered, her face pale as she tried to catch her breath. They're coming. Evan's blood ran cold. The birth was happening now, and they were far from ready. Panic surged through Evan as he knelt beside Laura, his hands instinctively reaching for hers. She was in pain, her face pale and glistening with sweat, her body tense as she fought to control her breathing. The moment he had dreaded had arrived far too soon. The twins were coming, and there was no turning back. Laura, stay with me, he said, his voice urgent but steady, trying to mask his own fear. You need to focus. Breathe. Laura nodded weakly, gripping his hand as another wave of pain washed over her. Her telepathic energy flared, and Evan felt it ripple through the air, faint but undeniable. The connection between them, the bond she had spoken of, seemed to hum with life, and he could feel the twins reaching out to him, their presence stronger than ever. They're close, Laura whispered, her voice strained. The twins, they know you're here. They're waiting for you. Evan's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to think of what to do. He had no experience with childbirth, let alone with alien children. But there was no time for hesitation. He had to act. He had to be there for her. He quickly gathered what supplies he could, moving with precision and focus despite the adrenaline rushing through his veins. Laura lay back, her body racked with contractions, and Evan knelt beside her, his hand never leaving hers. You're going to be okay, he said, his voice low and calm, though every fiber of his being was on edge. I'm right here. Laura's breathing became more labored, and she winced as another contraction hit her. It's happening, they're coming. Evan positioned himself at her side, doing his best to guide her through the process. He wasn't sure how much of his help would make a difference, but he knew one thing for certain. Laura wasn't going to go through this alone, not while he was there. Minutes felt like hours as the tension mounted. Laura's telepathic energy continued to pulse through the air, and Evan could feel the twins drawing closer. It was as if they were reaching out to him, seeking his presence, his strength. He had never felt anything like it, an unspoken, almost primal connection that went beyond words or thought. Laura cried out, her body tensing as the first twin began to emerge. Evan's heart raced as he guided the newborn into the world, his hands trembling slightly as he cradled the tiny, fragile form. The baby, a girl, was small but perfect, her skin a deep shade of violet, just like her mother's. She let out a weak cry, and Evan's chest tightened with emotion. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still as Evan looked down at the newborn in his arms. Her eyes, though barely open, seemed to focus on him, and in that instant, he felt the bond solidify. The connection that had been growing since the moment he had saved Laura now extended to her child, and he could feel the girl's presence in his mind, faint but clear. She knew him. She trusted him. Laura let out a soft, exhausted laugh, her eyes filled with relief and wonder as she looked at her daughter. "She's beautiful," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with love. Evan gently placed the newborn in Laura's arms, his heart swelling with a strange, fierce protectiveness. "She's strong," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "just like her mother." But there was no time to rest. Laura's body tensed again as the second twin prepared to enter the world. Evan moved quickly, his hand steady despite the flood of emotions coursing through him. The second twin, a boy, arrived soon after, his cries filling the cave as Evan cradled him in his arms. The boy's eyes opened briefly, and just like his sister, he seemed to focus on Evan, a flicker of recognition passing between them. The bond deepened, and Evan felt the weight of his new reality settle over him. These children, Laura's children, were now a part of him. He could feel their presence in his mind, as if they had always been there, waiting for this moment. Laura's exhaustion was palpable as she looked at her two children, her face a mixture of relief, joy, and sheer fatigue. They know you," she whispered, her eyes meeting Evan's. "You're their protector. They've chosen you just as I have." Evan swallowed hard, his emotions swirling inside him. He had never imagined himself in this position, holding two alien newborns, connected to them in ways he didn't fully understand. But now, standing here with Laura and their children, he couldn't deny the truth any longer. He was no longer just a lone soldier, wandering from one battle to the next. He was a part of something much bigger, a family. The thought both terrified and thrilled him. Laura's head leaned back against the cot, her body spent from the ordeal. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "for everything." Evan knelt beside her, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "We're in this together now." The twins, nestled in Laura's arms, seemed to sense the calm that had settled over the cave. Their cries had subsided, and they gazed up at their mother with wide, curious eyes. But every now and then, Evan could feel them reaching out to him, their tiny presences brushing against his mind like a gentle breeze. For a long moment, the cave was quiet, the only sounds the soft breathing of the newborns and the steady rhythm of Laura's heartbeat. Evan felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, even though he knew their journey was far from over. Laura's voice broke the silence, her words barely more than a whisper. "We need to leave soon. Now that the twins are here, we'll be more vulnerable than ever." Evan nodded, his mind already racing with plans. "I've been working on it. The cargo ship I mentioned, it's our best chance. We'll leave at first light." Laura's eyes fluttered closed, her exhaustion finally overtaking her. "I trust you," she murmured, her voice fading. "I trust you with them with our family." Evan's heart tightened at her words. Family. The word felt foreign on his tongue, but as he looked at Laura and the twins, he realized that it was true. They were his family now, whether he had been ready for it or not, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. The dawn came early, casting a pale light over the rocky landscape outside the cave. Evan was already awake, his mind sharp as he prepared for their departure. Laura was resting, though she stirred occasionally, her body still recovering from the birth. The twins were quiet in her arms, their small bodies swaddled in makeshift blankets. The air in the cave felt thick with tension, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. Evan had spent most of the night planning their escape. The cargo ship he had found months ago was their only hope of getting off this planet. He had repaired it as best he could, but it wasn't in perfect condition. Still, it would have to be enough. Once they were in the air, he could figure out their next move. He looked back at Laura, who was slowly waking, her eyes blinking open as she adjusted to the light. The twins remained nestled against her, their presence still palpable in the back of Evan's mind. The bond between them was stronger now, more pronounced. Every thought he had seemed to brush against theirs, like they were constantly aware of him, even in their sleep. "You ready?" Evan asked, his voice soft but urgent. Laura nodded, though her exhaustion was clear. "I'm ready. We have to go before they find us again." Evan's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. The bounty hunters wouldn't stop coming. Not as long as Laura and the twins were alive. They needed to disappear, to find a place where the Seraph couldn't reach them. But that was easier said than done. He moved quickly, gathering the last of their supplies and checking his weapons one final time. Everything was in place. Now it was just a matter of getting to the ship. "Can you walk?" Evan asked, turning to Laura. He knew she was still weak, but they didn't have the luxury of waiting any longer. "I'll manage," she said, her voice stronger than before. "The twins, they give me strength." Evan glanced at the twins, still amazed by the depth of the bond they shared with their mother and with him. He had felt it during the night, their telepathic presence constantly flickering at the edge of his thoughts, like they were watching over him, just as he was watching over them. It was strange, but not unwelcome. Laura slowly stood, cradling the twins in her arms. She looked at Evan, her violet eyes filled with a mixture of determination and gratitude. "I trust you, Evan. Whatever happens, I know you'll keep us safe." Evan felt a lump form in his throat at her words. He didn't respond right away, but instead gave her a firm nod, his expression serious. He wasn't going to let anything happen to them, not while he was alive. They moved quickly, stepping out into the open air as the sun rose higher in the sky. The landscape was barren and desolate, the remnants of past battles still visible in the distance. Evan led the way, his senses sharp as they made their way toward the canyon where the cargo ship was hidden. The journey was slow, especially with Laura still weak from the birth, but they pressed on, the urgency of their situation driving them forward. Evan kept a close eye on the horizon, always watching for any signs of movement, any indication that they were being followed. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the canyon. The ship lay half buried in the sand, its exterior weathered and rusted from years of neglect. It wasn't much to look at, but it was their only hope. Evan quickly set to work, checking the ship systems and preparing it for takeoff. He had done most of the repairs earlier, but there were still a few final touches that needed to be made. As he worked, he could feel the twins stirring in the back of his mind, their presence stronger now, more insistent. It was as if they knew something was about to happen. Laura sat nearby, watching him with quiet intensity. "How long will it take?" she asked, her voice soft. "Not long," Evan replied, his hands moving swiftly over the controls. "Just hold on a little longer." But even as he said the words, a cold chill ran down his spine. He looked up, his eyes scanning the canyon walls. Something wasn't right. The air felt too still, too quiet. "Laura," he said, his voice tense. "Get inside the ship, now." Laura didn't hesitate. She quickly gathered the twins and hurried toward the ship's open hatch, her heart racing as she sensed Evan's urgency. Evan grabbed his rifle, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon, and then he saw them, bounty hunters. 3 of them, moving quickly toward the canyon, their weapons drawn and their armor gleaming in the sunlight. They had found them. Evan's heart pounded as he raised his rifle, taking aim at the nearest target. He couldn't afford to waste time. The ship wasn't fully prepped for takeoff yet, but they were out of options. The first shot rang out, the crack of gunfire echoing through the canyon as Evan hit his mark. One bounty hunter dropped, but the others were closing in fast. He fired again, this time aiming for the second, but they had already taken cover behind the rocks. Laura, Evan shouted. Get the ship ready. We're leaving now. Inside the ship, Laura frantically worked to power up the engines, her telepathic abilities helping her to focus despite the chaos unfolding outside. The twins were awake now, their presence flooding her mind as they sensed the danger. Their connection to Evan flared, and she could feel their fear, their need for him to protect them. Evan ducked behind a boulder as another shot whizzed past his head. The bounty hunters were closing in, their movements swift and deadly. He fired again, managing to wound one, but the third was still advancing. Then, just as the bounty hunter prepared to fire, something extraordinary happened. A surge of energy shot through the air, rippling like an invisible wave. The bounty hunter froze, his weapon dropping from his hands as his body convulsed, his mind overwhelmed by a powerful force. Evan blinked in shock, then realized what had happened. The twins. They had intervened, their telepathic abilities flaring to life in a desperate attempt to protect their family. The bond between them and Evan had reached a new level, and now, even in their infancy, they were capable of incredible things. With the immediate threat neutralized, Evan wasted no time. He sprinted toward the ship, his heart pounding as he jumped into the cockpit beside Laura. "Engines are powered up," she said breathlessly, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "We're ready." Evan nodded, his hands flying over the controls as he guided the ship into the air. The engines roared to life, and the cargo ship lifted off the ground, leaving the canyon behind. As they ascended into the atmosphere, the weight of what they had just experienced settled over them. Laura looked at Evan, her expression soft but filled with awe. "The twins, they saved us." Evan glanced back at the newborns, who were now quiet and calm, their eyes half closed as they rested in their mother's arms. "They did," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and wonder. "They're stronger than we ever imagined." Laura smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "And so are you, Evan." For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the reality of their situation sinking in. They had escaped for now, but the road ahead was still uncertain. They didn't know where they would go or what challenges they would face. But one thing was clear: they were in this together. As the ship soared into space, Evan glanced over at Laura and the twins, a sense of calm settling over him. They were his family now, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. "Where do we go now?" Laura asked quietly, her eyes searching his. Evan's lips curved into a small, determined smile. "Wherever we need to." And with that, they left the planet behind, their new life and new adventure.